Hello, everyone. My name is Oz Fritz, and this is the first in a series of videos diving into a book called The Logic of Sense by Gilles Deleuze, which I consider to be one of the most, if not the most significant books on contemporary books on philosophy. This is the book here. As you can see, my copy is very well used. Logic of Sense remains a puzzling, enigmatic, mystifying work to me. I don't pretend to have it all figured out, but when I was looking for tutorial videos on it on YouTube, I was not satisfied completely with what I saw. So I hope to present some approaches toward trying to solve this enigmatic puzzle, or if you like, try to travel through the maze that this book presents. I also hope to show that Deleuze's philosophy can be extremely practical. This is not strictly, it is metaphysics, but it's not strictly abstract metaphysics that has no basis in your everyday life. I'll show that it can have very significant applications to your life. In the logic of sense, Deleuze presents the metaphysics of how things come into existence. Deleuze attempts in all his works to present a theory of everything. He doesn't want to just show how certain things come into existence, but it applies to every aspect of life, the physical, the mental, the emotional, the psychological, and the spiritual even. Deleuze doesn't shy away from tackling everything. Deleuze was a teacher of philosophy, but he wasn't the kind of teacher who just dishes out information. Deleuze's teaching method, I believe, at least in his printed works, because I never had the opportunity to actually go to one of his philosophy classes. He taught from 1969 until I think 87 or something like that at the University of Paris at Vincennes Saint-Denis. And that was one of the focal points of his life, was presenting these philosophy classes. So he is truly a philosophy teacher. But as I said, his method of teaching, he wants the students to figure things out, or he requires effort on the parts of the students to understand what he's getting at. He just doesn't present his ideas and say, that's it, deal with it. Or he sort of presents a roadmap for the student to come to their own understanding. So in the logic of sense, for this video, where you're just going to look at the preface, it's a very short preface, but it has some very valuable clues about how to go about understanding the book. So Deleuze tells us that he's presenting a series of paradoxes. Every what we would normally call chapter is a different paradox, and this is very important. And it shows right away how Deleuze is trying to get people thinking for themselves, because he doesn't explain the paradoxes. You have to come to terms with them on your own, and by making that effort, I actually believe that new neural pathways are formed, because you have to come to grips with how two things seemingly opposite and contradictory present something, how these paradoxes present information or present knowledge. Okay, so One of the things, actually, before I get into the preface, that's very important if you're trying to decipher Deleuze is to look at his background influences. To not, his books don't stand alone. They're like a matrix that connects to all kinds of other thinkers. Before Deleuze wrote The Logic of Sense and his previous book, Difference and Repetition, his literary career, his writing was all on other philosophers, which he called an apprenticeship. That is, he wrote books about David Hume, Nietzsche, Bergson, various other philosophers, and Difference and Repetition, Deleuze's book prior to Logic of Sense, was his first book on his own, about his own philosophy. And then Logic of Sense is the second one. And so in Logic of Sense, in the preface, he tells us what the two primary influences on the book are, which is the title of the preface. It's called From Lewis Carroll to the Stoics. And one of the paradoxes in the book is that nonsense and sense have an intrinsic relationship. He says that sense is produced out of nonsense. Now, one of the first questions people, or at least I had, was what exactly does he mean by sense? And he'll give us various descriptors of what he means by sense throughout the book. And again, leave it to the student to piece it together for themselves. So, there's a lot of, the paradoxes have a lot of duality to them, for instance, sense and nonsense. And from Lewis Carroll to the Stoics, he's taking Lewis Carroll, who presented a lot of nonsense, and bringing that to the the school of philosophy known as the Stoics. Now, most people commonly think of, the word stoic means enduring hardship without complaining or without, freaking out about it or whatever. That's what we mean by the word stoic. And later on in Logic of Sense, Deleuze looks at that, but not, interestingly enough, from the point of view of the Stoic philosophers. He looks at it in a different way. So he takes this Lewis Carroll, who wrote basically children's books, and he brings that into the world of philosophy through Stoics. So I'm just going to read a couple of sentences that I think are key to this. So he starts off his preface. The work of Lewis Carroll has everything required to please the modern reader. Children's books, or rather, books for little girls, splendidly bizarre and esoteric words, grids, codes, and decodings, drawings and photographs, a profound psychoanalytic content, and an exemplary logical and linguistic formalism. That's the first sentence in the book. One of the things that interested me about this is he mentions codes and decodings, and that is helpful for understanding the book, because there is codes in the book that take you deeper than just the literal interpretation of the words. We know from others that Lewis Carroll, in the Alice in Wonderland books, there's a great deal of Kabbalah, the Hebrew mystical system of correspondences. And so knowing that, that is a kind of a code, and that's one of the codes that we will encounter in the Logic of Sense. So, he's trying to look at there's a lot of dualities in this book, and one of them is between language and things. In traditional philosophy, that would be looked at as the intelligible versus the sensible. But he says that it is not exactly that. But that's sort of two of the main lines is language, how we use language to perceive the reality of the things in the world. And of course, we'll get into that more as we get into the different chapters. So he says he presents here a series of paradoxes which form the theory of sense. So here's one of the first paradoxes. He says, it is easy to explain why this theory is inseparable from paradoxes. Sense is a non-existing entity. So what does that mean? There's a paradox right there. He's saying an entity means it's something that's alive, but he's saying it's non-existing. What does this mean? I'm not going to, give my interpretation of what that might mean. One might look into Hindu or Buddhist philosophy on the illusory nature of the world. That might be a clue. Later on, Deleuze will get into Zen a little bit, so that's not completely out of line. But that he starts right away by saying sense is a non-existing entity, by throwing a puzzle or a paradox in our face right at the beginning. So he explains in the preface why Lewis Carroll, and then he goes on to say why the Stoics. And he chose the Stoics, he said, because it presents the new image of the philosopher, different from the pre-Socratic philosophers and Plato and Aristotle and the lineage that came from that. It's useful to know that one of Deleuze's projects is what he called overturning Platonism, overturning Plato's philosophy as the sort of dominant way of looking at the world. And to that effect, the Logic of Sense contains a series of 34 chapters, and then in the appendixes, there's some other articles, and one of them is called Plato and the Simulacrum, and that more directly addresses his project of overturning Plato, and which he says that he picked up from Nietzsche. And I just want to read another short passage from the preface that, again, is very useful to know regarding how to approach logic of sense. So he calls the chapters, he doesn't call them chapters, he calls them series. Thus, to each series, there corresponds figures which are not only historical, but topological and logical as well. As on a pure surface, certain points of one figure in a series refer to points of another figure. An entire galaxy of problems with their corresponding dice throws, stories, and places. A complex place, a, quote, convoluted story, unquote. This book is an attempt to develop a logical and psychological novel. Okay, so what he's saying by this is that the series or the chapters do not necessarily need to be read in order, that that some of the series relate to other series in a non-linear fashion, so that if one's studying these, one can group together series that cover certain points, and they might not necessarily follow one after the other. And then when he says he's attempting to develop a logical and psychological novel, again, looking at his influences, we find James Joyce in there. And James Joyce was was about the multiplicity of meanings. So we can just look at a logical and psychological novel. Deleuze is concerned with the production of the new. And with that, I'll leave it here and see you next time for the first series of paradoxes of pure becoming.